listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank-and-file news and organizing tactics. I'm pod co-host Danielle Smith, organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm pod co-host Natasha Elena Yulman, a staff writer at Labor Notes.
On the cover of the next Labor Notes, our August-September joint issue, is a feature story on tensions between this administration and the building trades and how their members are trying to push leadership by organizing from below. Because building trade workers, electricians, carpenters, and other construction workers are already facing the consequences of this administration's culture war crusades, which in practice are material attacks on the working class. For example, building trades members have been targets of an indiscriminate mass deportations program, carried out by what appear to regular people as roving gangs of masked men in plainclothes suddenly barging into homes or vehicles, pulling weapons on civilians, and spiriting them away in what are essentially state-sanctioned kidnappings. Probably one of the most high-profile targets of this campaign is sheet metal worker Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a member of Smart Local 100. You might remember how the administration shipped him off earlier this year to El Salvador in defiance of federal court orders. It was only after his union siblings at SMART spent months rallying for him to be returned home to his family in Maryland that the administration brought him back to the U.S. But they're still holding him in custody, while the Department of Justice has whipped up criminal charges against him. Building trades workers are also dealing with the fallout of this administration's rejection of climate change and therefore renewable energy projects. In a fiery statement in June, Sean McGarvey, the president of the North America's Building Trades Union, NABTU, warned that the GOP's budget bill, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, would endanger 1.75 million construction jobs, including by limiting clean energy tax credits. And some building trades workers are also feeling the effects of the administration's attacks on anything it perceives as efforts to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Joining Natasha and I today to talk about all this, we have someone you kind of hear from and hear about every week in the pod. The writer and performer of our title music, who also happens to be our coworker covering the building trades, Keith Brower-Brown. Keith and Natasha co-wrote our lead story in the upcoming August-September issue of Labor Notes, titled Construction Unions Face a Choice: Cave or Defend Members? We're going to be talking about what they both have been hearing from members. Keith, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Thanks for walking us through some of the big picture stakes right now for construction workers, Danielle. I think before we dive into our reporting and some of the interesting dynamics within these unions, it might be helpful to talk through some context on dynamics within the building trades overall, which has historically been maybe the most gender and racially exclusive sector in the U.S. labor movement. Keith, could you talk a little bit about that and who these workers are and how they relate to the labor movement?
Definitely. So the building trades are construction unions, which have about 1 million members in the United States, more or less. And that's been slowly declining over the years since roughly the 1950s or 60s were their peak, when most construction in many, many states in this country, if not all of them, was unionized, including the residential sector. Since that period, there's been this huge anti-union assault from major buyers of construction. Home builders especially have really kicked unions out. And unions are stuck with this remaining union contract on federal construction, some kinds of other public, state, and local construction, and then big industrial jobs. There's other odds and ends that they get out there, but those are the trends. And as you said, Natasha, these have been some of the most exclusive unions historically. There's still only about 5% women, less in many of the trades. They have been historically actually had a lot of immigrants in them. A lot of Southern European and Irish immigrants going back 100 years ago were huge parts of building and winning these unions and fighting bosses to unionize this sector. But in the post-war era in the U.S., these became kind of the most infamous unions of racial exclusion, and the civil rights movement waged a lot of battles to get more Black members into these unions and challenge exclusionary practices where your son or your cousin got guaranteed a spot if you were already a member through some sort of backdoor deal. And that has been changing in many of these unions in pretty significant ways in the last few decades, with a lot more inclusion of Latino members in particular, and gradually more inclusion of women, although still very far from anything like a majority. Yeah, the current situation is threatening to really upend sort of the bulwark of where these unions still have some strength. So that's why we're talking about it today.
In this piece, we also get into another growing divide in the building trades, especially as union density declines, which is between workers on union projects versus those on non-union projects who are often non-English speaking and non-citizens. Could you talk about the difference in the kinds of projects they work on and some differences in their working conditions?
Absolutely. So I mentioned there are about 1 million unionized construction workers in the United States. Unfortunately, there are 9 million total construction workers in the United States. Of those 9 million, about 3 million are immigrants, like first generation immigrants currently. And construction is the largest sector of employment for Latino men in the United States, with, last I checked, over 20% of Latino men employed in construction. But there's been, as part of this anti-union assault, going back to the 70s, from contractors and construction employers, there has been a really aggressive effort, including by major corporations who buy a lot of construction work, to create a sort of Wild West non-union sector that has a lot of repression of workers, and they have wanted workers who they can repress, and so have sort of fostered immigrant and undocumented labor as part of that. And in some cases, unions have done some impressive work to try and help organize non-union immigrant workers and bring them into unions. But by and large, the overwhelming story has been one where construction unions have kind of hunkered down with their existing members in the sectors where they have some contracts and really struggled, or more often not even tried at all, to go out and help immigrant workers organize themselves and turn these, generally horrible non-union contractors into unionized shops.
So maybe that makes something you both address in this piece not so surprising, which is how building trades union leaders have had a somewhat conflicted response to this administration. Could you talk a little bit about that and also some of the ways members are pushing for a more firm position against these attacks?
Yeah, so there's been a pretty wide spectrum in terms of how leaders are responding to this moment. But in broad strokes, there's been kind of a shift from a kind of chumminess with Trump that we saw in his first term to a sort of quiet condemnation, or in some cases, open criticism of his administration. As you mentioned earlier, Danielle, the abduction of sheet metal worker and Smart Local 100 member Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia has been a flashpoint. Smart officers have held rallies demanding his release. His detention was condemned by the Painters Union. And actually, Sean McGarvey, president of the North America's Building Trades Unions, demanded his release to cheers and applause at their legislative conference in April. And you have some members who are pushing their unions to take a more active stance in this political moment. You've got the Latin American Electrical Workers Alliance, LAEWA, a caucus of members and some staff that is advocating for IBEW locals to adopt an immigrant defense resolution. We'll get into that in a bit. That said, some folks are definitely sticking their heads down and hoping this all blows over.
Yeah, the clearest example of that is in the Carpenters Union, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters, which has been a kind of notorious lone wolf to many in the building trades for at least a few decades. It disaffiliated from the AFL-CIO Union Federation in the early 2000s, and since then has often competed, or in the eyes of other unions, kind of raided jobs that their trade would take on, particularly laborers, cement masons. There's been a lot of beef between this union and other union in the building trades. But this is mostly the fault, we should say, not of members, many of whom in the Carpenters are really committed to trying to build more solidarity with other trades. But this has been the fault of one of the most undemocratic leaderships in the union movement in this country under President Doug McCarran, which has really aggressively consolidated power across the union, taking it out of the hands of locals and members to even vote to approve their own union contract, which is something we take for granted in a lot of the rest of the union movement, but has been stripped from nearly all the locals and the Carpenters. So there is some background then to an even more undemocratic push that has played out in the last few months, when this same international leadership of the union under McCarran pushed to strip and stop support for the official women's committee of the union, Sisters in the Brotherhood, cheekily titled because it was founded by women in the union who weren't getting official support and push to have a space to support each other and stand up to misogyny on the job site and in the union, and has gradually over the years become more officially incorporated and supported by the union officialdom. But all that came to a screeching halt a couple months ago when McCarran sent out a letter to all locals and regional heads saying, you got to cut support for the sisters and anything else that has a whiff of a diversity program, we are cutting out support for. And this was a really brief letter, but the only excuse they gave was, in light of the recent federal attacks on diversity and equity initiatives, we are jumping out and getting rid of this in our union. To my knowledge, there has not been any case in recent decades of a union's tax-exempt status being threatened for political purposes, although it has happened for failure at doing proper IRS filings or something like that. But this seemed to a lot of union members like a just made-up excuse to cut support, not just for Sisters in the Brotherhood, but for a few smaller officially supported or formerly supported member groups for Black members, Latino members, and LGBTQ members. So this quickly raised a lot of outrage from a bunch of members, including ones who had previously been on somewhat friendly terms with leadership. So we should definitely talk about that member fight back.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's, a lot of this has been coming from the leadership, and I'm really curious how the members have been responding.
So the most organized effort so far has been a push from carpenters, especially sisters, to pass a resolution in their locals, to then get a resolution on the agenda for the International Convention of the Carpenters coming up in August of this year, pretty soon. And this resolution would say we're returning support to Sisters in the Brotherhood. We're also restoring official union support and funding to send members of the carpenters to the Tradeswomen Build Nations Conference, which is a huge conference across trades that's been going on for well over a decade. And that resolution has now passed in 8 different locals around the country, which is no joke in a union that has not had a whole lot of organized practice of dissent or reform caucuses in recent years, although we should credit the fact that in locals in Portland, Oregon, and in Cleveland, Ohio, there are local reform caucuses. The Ohio one is actually seeking to grow more nationally. It's called Carpenters Rank and File Together, and has made some contacts with other locals. These groups are trying to win back the right to vote on their contracts and challenge top-down decisions over what goes into the contracts. But they've also stepped up to try and support sisters and defend these spaces for a more inclusive unionism within the carpenters.
So you've touched on this, Natasha, but can you say a bit more about how Lewa's efforts are going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they've been really successful. Over the past few weeks, this immigrant defense resolution I mentioned has been adopted by locals in LA, Denver, Houston, Portland, Oakland, Richmond, and the suburbs of San Francisco and Seattle. After Local 11 adopted the resolution, officers sent staff to a Free Kilmar rally in LA, even though previously there'd been some hesitance around quote-unquote divisive issues. I think this is a really important effort. These members have a really inspiring vision of solidarity in action, and they also recognize that an attack on one is really an attack on all workers. They want to see an end to the structural barriers that keep non-English speaking electrical workers from joining the union. Many locals have no Spanish language applications or training programs, workers told me, even where state certification programs are already available in Spanish. Here's what Francisco Paco Arago, a journeyman wireman and member of IBEW Local 11, told me. He said, quote, "I was an organizer for a few years in the local, and I had to turn away dozens of electricians. You're watching him pull wire, you're watching him do the work, and he can't come because he knows damn well he cannot even fill out the application without asking for his niece to come sit down next to him and help him," unquote. And Jesus Padilla, an electrical apprentice in the Oakland area who is pushing for his local to pass the immigrant defense resolution, put it this way. In our constitution for the IBEW, it clearly states that we want to organize every electrician, every electrical worker. It doesn't say every Caucasian worker, it doesn't say every English-speaking worker, it doesn't say every Christian worker. It says every electrical worker.
Thank you both. This piece is a really great reminder that sometimes what we see and hear from the loudest union officials isn't always the whole story. That's our episode. Check out this and many other stories in the August-September issue. If you don't already, subscribe to the Labor Notes magazine on our website at labornotes.org/subscribe. To start getting the magazine from the October issue on, subscribe by September 15th.
In the meantime, we also have a number of workshops coming up in August, including our Race and Labor series on Thursdays, August 7th, 14th, and 21st. And our next Stewards workshop is on Monday, August 18th, on the topic of just cause, led by labor attorney Bob Schwartz, who's written a number of books you might know on the topic of just cause and stewards, including The Legal Rights of Union Stewards and Just Cause, a union guide to winning discipline cases. You can sign up for those at labornotes.org/events.
Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify, and if you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode. The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Natasha Elena Ullman, Cindy Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by, of course, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.